Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, we dealing with a global pandemic in the viral type, infecting people, causing chaos and mayhem. But that's small change compared to the mind virus of Bitcoin. You know, if you're a really smart person, it makes you even smarter. That's the thing about this virus. Stacy.
Max, indeed, Keiser Report has been officially declared full of smart, sophisticated people, audience, and presenters, and bullish on humanity. That's the important thing to note. Bullish on humanity. That is what Paul Tudor Jones calls the Bitcoin crowd. And we're going to get into exactly what he said here. And this is a quote from his appearance on CNBC. Bitcoin has an enormous contingent of really, really smart, sophisticated people who believe in it. You've got this group crowdsourced from all over the world that is dedicated to seeing it succeed. So I like Bitcoin even more now than I did when I bought it back in March or April. So that's his bit where he's saying how smart and sophisticated the people involved in Bitcoin are. And then we're going to get on the bullish and humanity bit in a moment.
Right. Well, that's you, Keiser Report audience. You are sophisticated, smart, and are loving and have pure souls. And together, the crowd became one kind of sphere of goodness that catapulted Bitcoin on a vector that's escaping this place called planet Earth. And it's attracting an intelligence and a spiritual force so powerful that not even this presidential election in America is going to throw off course. Yeah, that's right.
So the bullish on humanity bit, because he's comparing the Bitcoin space to the gold space and to the bond investor space, to people shorting U.S. treasuries or shorting the dollar, people betting against the U.S. economy by going long gold. And he's basically, I'm going to read you two quotes in tweets from him of people summarizing his appearance on CNBC, in which he was, even though he's a big gold holder, he's saying like that's a bet on a dystopian future and that humanity is horrible. And Bitcoin is a bet that humans are innovative and interesting and, you know, filled with life and possibility. So PTJ, who is Paul Tudor Jones, said something incredible on CNBC today. Quote, "I've never seen a store of value where you also have such great intellectual capital behind it. When you short the bond market as an inflation hedge, you're really betting on the fallacy of mankind rather than its ingenuity." And then the same person summarized another thing that Paul Tudor Jones said. PTJ says other inflation hedges are fundamentally bearish humanity, whereas Bitcoin is bullish humanity. That is an incredible statement that I've never seen expressed so clearly before.
Right. Now, okay, when we talked about Paul Tudor Jones getting into Bitcoin originally, we said this was the elephant in the room. This is one of the most important guys in finance in decades. He called the crash of 1987 famously. That was an example of betting on humanity taking a hit. And so now he's saying, look, we're heading into an inflationary world because the central banks have done a terrible job for decades now, and the governments have underreported inflation by 5, 6, 7% for a couple of decades now. And the inflation genie is coming out of the bottle, which means the bond market is really going to end its 40-year bull market. And that means that humanity is going to take a massive hit. And of course, you can short the bond market, and you can do a number of other things to make money on the collapse, as people made money on the collapse of Greece. If you recall, they bought the credit default swap and they profited on Greece's demise. Paul Tudor Jones is saying something remarkable here. I've never actually heard anyone say this in the realm of professional finance, that this bet on Bitcoin is pro-humanity, even though it means you are banking on inflation. So what he is saying is that the inflation, no matter how bad it is, will not trump the goodness of an inflating value of Bitcoin. So he's got inflation is obviously going to cause huge misery as interest rates go up and the world goes bankrupt. But if you own Bitcoin, the humanity boosting properties of it on a profound, excellent trajectory towards sainthood is much more powerful. And this is an amazing equilibrium busting game-changing, Paul Tudor Jones enhancing, and Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy boosting moment in history.
Well, indeed. And let's try to imagine what he's actually saying here with this bullishness on humanity is, as you mentioned, like he became a very wealthy guy from the 1987 stock market crash, where he predicted this was going to happen. He sold out, and then I guess shorted as well. So he could see what was coming. At the same time, today, he's reappeared back on the market, being very vocal, seeing again what can't sustain itself. And you could do one of two things. In 1987 was the beginning of the plunge protection team and the mass intervention by the likes of the Federal Reserve Bank and the US Treasury to make sure the billionaire class do not ever suffer losses. And that ultimately is very bearish on humanity, because you think that, this class of people, investors, the capitalism, our innovation and, surviving and innovating through collapse, the creative destruction, that these things don't exist. What he's saying is like, here is a class of people in the Bitcoin space who just reimagined something positive. Okay, you look at the money printer go brrr, you look at the Federal Reserve bailing out everybody, intervening in the price discovery mechanism, which somebody like Paul Tudor Jones would think is very, very crucial, right? The price discovery. And if the Fed doesn't believe in it, well, here are these people who do believe in it, and they've invented this perfect market.
Right. And you say that it was the beginning of the plunge protection team, and it's right there in the Genesis block of Bitcoin, Chancellor on brink of second bailout. It's a direct reference to the Bank of England, which was mimicking the Federal Reserve Bank in constantly bailing out the billionaire class and allowing the underlying economy to decay, atrophy, and give rise to enormous social unrest and an incapacity for governments to deal with pandemics or any crisis.
Yes. So I think, with the way I interpret what he's saying is that this group of people around the world who are Bitcoiners have managed to go in a positive direction. That, no matter how much limitation there is on supply, for example, we can innovate our way to a sort of growth within that. We can't just intervene and print money for free for everybody.
Well, you equate that to the Renaissance. And I think it is a Renaissance moment, because in the Renaissance, the population had been stifled by an omnipresent, omnipotent church. And then the Renaissance provided a vector out. And we have the Enlightenment, and we had modernity as we know that term today. In 2009, when the Genesis block happened and Bitcoin was birthed, that was interestingly, it was the similar vector out of the central bank papacy that has kept humanity in the dark.
And back then, people were ruled, their daily lives were governed by religion, by what the Vatican said. And when the institution of the Vatican failed to be able to respond to the Black Plague, which wiped out up to half the population of Europe, that's when their faith in that institution collapsed. And then we had to then turn to the positive movement of the Renaissance, that man himself can respond, man himself can innovate and be beautiful and do things for himself. Today, obviously we live in a financialized world of the papacy of the Federal Reserve Bank and all the central banks of the world. And here we've had the same thing. The institutions have failed to stop the rampant fraud, to stop the rampant growth in the wealth and income gap. And I want to mention also that, with Paul Tudor Jones, and he's reflecting on the community, just like Michael Saylor had done when he converted $420 million of his treasury of MicroStrategy into Bitcoin. He commented on the community. And I want to say that's really where Keiser Report in particular excels, because we've been covering it first of all global media, which is the Keiser Report. We were talking about this back in 2011, 2012, 2013, when you could still get Bitcoin for as little as $1 back then, even under $1 at some points. So, that our message, because of the broadcast reach of Keiser Report into Argentina, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, all of Asia, Middle East, like it was like a fair dispersal and distribution of Bitcoin around the world. And I think that's also something so beautiful about it. in a post-globalization era. It's like the globalization run by the central banks is over. Globalization run by, unfair trade agreements is over. This is the new world where there's, powerful individuals. The individual is once again powerful and sovereign.
I cannot improve on that. It's just so
Wow,
well said.
that's a first in 1,612 episodes.
I'm just luxuriating in the brilliance and the beauty that is Stacy.
Well, of course, it wouldn't be possible without Max's faces. All your memifying face, people like to meme your face and your emotions and your passion for individual sovereignty, no matter where you are around the world. That's important.
Satoshi, obviously.
So in the last moment here, I also want to say, this headline, and probably we'll get into it in the next episode, but we have 2 minutes left. And here is Move Over Bonds, FX taking over as investors' new favorite playbook. Remember, this is the people, individuals versus the Fed-controlled economy for certain people, whereby price discovery is not allowed. Buying bonds at the rate of roughly $2 billion per hour in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, central banks have crushed volatility and reduced its efficacy as a signaling instrument. While the collapse in interest rate differentials could lead to a fall in currency price swings as rate changes in their relative levels are major drivers for exchange rate moves, investors say the lack of these two factors is making currency markets more volatile. And Max, the important thing about this is that, the Fed is driving bond investors into the Forex markets, which is the murkiest zero-sum game of Forex trading, which is $5 trillion a day. This has major implications from investors to central banks because the former express their views on the economic outlook or major events via the bond markets. So investors look at the bond markets, but the bond markets are no longer signaling because the Fed has intervened so much that there's no price signal there, which the latter the central banks use as a tool for the transmission of their monetary policy. So, with the Vatican, they send out the smoke signals to tell you whether or not they've elected a new pope. And here, that's the equivalent of there are no smoke signals at all coming out of the Fed because there's no signal. They've destroyed all signals.
No, the bond market has been euthanized, and investors are seeking yield by trying to engage in carry trades and currency arbitrage in the Forex market. Now, the big difference between trying to eke out 1 or 2% in the Forex market versus the bond market is that in the bond market, you've got maturities ranging from 1 year to 30 years. And that's the bedrock and the foundation is the bond market, which has long-term maturities. That's why it's used to finance governments, for example. If the bond market has been euthanized and you're relying on Forex, it increases instability in the global markets by a factor of 1,000 times because the maturity there is no maturity. The Forex market has no maturity at all. It's simply a live, living, fragile organism driven entirely by capital flows that could either could dry up at any second, which would mean the entire souffle of the global finance market would collapse in a minute.
We're bullish on humanity, and I think we could look at this positive or negative, but here is a story that they're doing wrong, but we're spinning it into a positive way of what you could just exit that system. You don't need to become a Forex trader. That's not what your pension fund should be doing. And the fact that the Fed hates humanity so much that they're forcing your future into these Forex markets, that's absurd.
Well, we got to take a break. But during the time, contemplate this. Did Bitcoin cause the chaos or does it respond to the chaos? Think about it. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to entrepreneur Dan Collins, who lived in China for about 2 decades, published the China Money Report while there, been on this show many times with his expertise. He was the first to say right here on Keiser Report nearly 5 years ago that the U.S. and China were already in a trade war, only the U.S. didn't know about it, and that China was winning. Dan, welcome back.
Hey, Max. Good to be back.
It's been a while since we spoke, but what is your general assessment of the ongoing Trump trade war against China? Where is Trump winning? Where is he losing? Dan.
Winning and losing. He's winning. It was originally winning, I'd say pre-COVID, as a lot of companies were looking to come back. There's a lot of duties on Chinese companies now. If you actually import-export things, you see it. There's Section 301 of the trade code, which is basically taxing Chinese companies at 25, 30%, depending on the item. So that's driving a lot of jobs to Vietnam, to Mexico, also the U.S. And that was kind of what was behind the trade war originally. He's collected hundreds of billions of dollars in duties. And this is all really to level the playing field against China. China has built up the economy behind high tariff trade barriers. They've had 40% duties against American companies forever. They've banned American companies. There's a lot of reasons behind that. Some of them deserve to get banned, like people that were spying on them, Cisco and Google and Facebook. But in general, they're a mercantilist economy. A lot of East Asian economies are. They built up their own countries on the back of gaming the trade system. And Trump was trying to create an even playing field. But it's a mixed bag right now. The trade deficit continues to go up because you do not change these things overnight. It's been developing for 3 decades. It's going to take a decade to fix.
It seems almost, I'm curious what you think about this, that you had this COVID crisis, which is a global crisis. And out of the crisis, it seems like the only economy experiencing a V-shaped recovery is China. Everyone else is falling apart. It's similar, in my view, to World War II. You had this global conflict. The only country that emerged out of World War II intact was the United States, and then it went on, the American century, as we call it. What do you think about that?
It's a good point. I completely agree. It's what we're seeing is it's very historical. China's back to normal. They haven't had a COVID death since in March. They are pretty much back to normal. They're still very vigilant. They have the masks, they have the tracking app. But what China did to contain COVID within their borders was amazing how they handled big data. They instantly came out with apps. Everyone has an app on their phone. You need to show a green light before entering public spaces. The amount of resources that were deployed to contain the virus were astonishing. I mean, they were the model. And a lot of people say, well, you can do that in an authoritarian country. You don't need to be an authoritarian country to have a health app, right, that starts tracking COVID. They track them down in neighborhoods. City of Dalian, they found 12 cases. They tested everybody, 10 million people. So we were late. Our response was good in some areas, terrible in other areas. We still aren't doing masks like we need to do. We still aren't doing contact tracing, not enough testing. We boggled the response. Europe had a hard lockdown originally, but then they just came out of it like nothing's happening. They're at record cases today as we speak. U.S. is at record cases as we speak, and we're still we could be at the foothills of an exponential growth curve of this thing. So China, their GDP is already going to be up. They're going to be up 10% next year over where they were last year. We're going to be 4 years just to recover the GDP levels we were at in 2019. So we're seeing a flip of the switch. And China's coming out of this, like you point out, like America came out of World War II, the only game in town.
Now, we've been talking to you for many years, and you've been alerting folks for many years that the China manufacturing and industrial and economic forces were not to be trifled with. This was on a serious growth track, and that the U.S. should really start to think of China competitively in a way that they would respond. And when this COVID crisis hit, and America couldn't even manufacture masks at scale and distribute them in any meaningful way, I think a lot of people were horrified by this because it truly did indicate that the U.S. had been asleep at the switch, something that we've been talking about and you've been writing about for many years. So this crisis didn't start with COVID. It's been building for many years, and Stacy Herbert likes to refer to it as the Thucydides trap. There seems to be a changing of the guard between the U.S. as world reserve currency, now a world dominant economy, changing now to the U.S. Now let's get into some of the minutiae here that kind of highlights what's happening under the surface. During the vice presidential debate, censors in China cut away from Mike Pence during his answer on China relations and then cut back when Kamala Harris answered that question. What does that tell you about China's thoughts about this 2020 race? Dan?
Well, they clearly don't want Trump. They don't know how to deal with Trump. Yeah, I saw that report. China's been blocking things like CNN for literally decades. I used to sit at home in China, and as soon as China was discussed on CNN, the screen goes blank. It's actually not a surprise for anybody that's lived there. They have, their censorship is, they have their own systems for that. 2020 election, they're definitely behind a Biden. They've worked with him. He's their business partner, with the whole Hunter Biden scandal. So I think China, at the end of the day, though, China, they'll just deal with whoever's there, and they continue their rising progression in all areas, in the economy, military, finance, everything.
There used to be a time when Americans would argue that, well, China's authoritarian and America's got freedom and we've got free speech, and ultimately that's going to be the winning hand going forward. And but then when you have the New York Times just recently arguing on a major op-ed piece that maybe we don't need free speech in America and arguing for censorship, it seems like they've capitulated and said, look, we're never going to win with free speech. We have to now march to China's tune and try to be the best second-rate country we can possibly be. In looking at another story, TikTok destroyed all domestic competition, and now Trump wants to ban them. Why is TikTok the top competitor in the AI-driven viral video space? Where else is China dominating? Again, the TikTok story and the AI story, you've been telling people for years. Now suddenly it's on everyone's radar. What can you tell us about this?
Let's go back and look at Huawei, right? We kind of woke up. This is nothing to do with COVID. We woke up on Huawei and looked at, oh my goodness, the Chinese dominate 5G in the telecom space. We literally don't have a company that makes 5G equipment, right? Europe does, Ericsson and Nokia, but they exist only because Huawei lets them. Huawei's now doing their own chips. The last vestige of technology supremacy the U.S. had was in chips. That's going to be gone in 2 to 3 years. Huawei's all over the world. Now all the data networks will go all through Huawei equipment and Huawei software. The companies we had that could have been making telecom equipment, they got into financing mortgage-backed securities in Eastern Europe, right? This is all go follow the root cause. It goes back to the money printing, the finance capitalism. We treat fixed assets as a curse. We don't want them. We don't want we don't want R&D. Our R&D spend in U.S. has collapsed, right? All of our U.S. technical supremacy started with R&D spending, Bell Labs, places like this. But back to China. So you've got Huawei dominating 5G tech. You've got TikTok that came out of nowhere. They're based out of Shanghai. As regards to banning them or not, how is a Chinese social media company able to run circles around our companies? All our companies are banned in China. So I think, as a banning TikTok's not out of the question. Industry after industry, you mentioned the mass and it's antibiotics, it's everything. We don't make anything anymore. The GDP's fake. We've talked about it on the show for years. Now with COVID, our service sector economy has been destroyed. All these people are unemployed. We have a huge structural unemployment coming. We're not making anything. We have to go back to making things and looking what China's done. We have to start taking a practical approach to catching back up. We're literally in a catch-up phase now with China, which, e-commerce, this year in e-commerce, we're going to hit $400 billion. Sounds good. China did $2 trillion. So how is our economy bigger than China's? First of all, we have to it's like an alcoholic, Max. We have to realize we have a problem before we fix it.
Right, absolutely. Now, Dan Collins, the Thucydides trap, it's transition from one superpower to the next. And many people say that empires die from within and not from without. And clearly, the American empire is killing itself. And a great example would be IBM, International Business Machines. They bought back $130 billion of their own stock, and the current market cap is around $110 billion. That's a way to commit corporate suicide, by just buying back your own stock, but never investing in R&D, new products, marketing. Just let yourself die so a few executives can walk away with huge golden handshakes and retirements. Now let's talk about JP Morgan and Ant Financial, talk about financial services. This seems to be an emerging story, Dan.
Yeah, Ant Financial, it's an incredible story. They're doing their roadshow for their IPO now this week in Europe, US, and China. They're going to have the largest IPO the world's ever seen. Going to value them at $350 billion. Their IPO is going to be bigger than Saudi Aramco. They're going to raise about $30 billion. There's estimates this could go up to a $500 billion valuation company. It's going to, in one shot, be way bigger than JP Morgan. And I like to to compare and contrast Ant Financial versus JP Morgan. So Ant Financial has 3 revenue streams. They basically came out of Alibaba. Jack Ma said, wasn't happy with the Chinese financial system. You're not getting enough small loans to small business people. If you don't change it, we will. And they actually did change it. So they're doing payments. They charge 0.01% transaction fee on a payment. They're connecting 80 million merchants, $16 trillion in payments. That's 25 times bigger than PayPal. But they've also revolutionized. They've gone into credit lending and assets under management. You can get a loan on Ant Financial within 3 minutes, $1,000, $2,000, unsecured loans. This is creating frictional e-commerce, frictional commerce. So they're revolutionizing finance in China, what the banks here should have been doing.
Right. Dan Collins, we got to cut it off there. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thanks, guys.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Dan Collins. Until next time, bye, y'all.